Containment was a United States policy to prevent the spread of communism abroad. A component of the Cold War, this policy was a response to a series of moves by the Soviet Union to enlarge communist influence in Eastern Europe, China, Korea, Africa, and Vietnam. It represented a middle ground position between appeasement and rollback. The basis of the doctrine was articulated in a 1946 cable by U.S. diplomat George F. Kennan. As a description of U.S. foreign policy, the word originated in a report Kennan submitted to U.S. Defense Secretary James Forrestal in 1947, a report that was later used in a magazine article. It is a translation of the French cordon sanitaire, used to describe Western policy toward the Soviet Union in the 1920s. The word containment is associated most strongly with the policies of U.S. President Harry Truman, including the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a mutual defense pact. Although President Dwight Eisenhower toyed with the rival doctrine of rollback, he refused to intervene in the Hungarian uprising of 1956. President Lyndon Johnson cited containment as a justification for his policies in Vietnam. President Richard Nixon, working with advisor Henry Kissinger, followed a policy called copyright tent, or relaxation of tensions. This involved expanded trade and cultural contacts, as well as the strategic arms limitation talks. President Jimmy Carter at first emphasized human rights rather than anti-communism. He dropped this stance and returned to containment when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. President Ronald Reagan, denouncing the Soviet state as an evil empire, escalated the Cold War and promoted rollback in Nicaragua and Afghanistan. Central programs begun under containment, including NATO and nuclear deterrence, remained in effect even after the end of the Cold War. Early uses, although the term containment was first used for the strategy in the 1940s, there were major historical precedents familiar to Americans and Europeans. In the 1850s, anti-slavery forces in the United States developed a containment strategy for stopping the expansion of slavery and forcing its collapse. Historian James Oakes explains this strategy: the federal government would surround the South with free states, free territories, and free waters, building what they called a cordon of freedom around slavery, hemming it in until the system's own internal weaknesses forced the slave states one by one to abandon slavery. Following the 1917 Communist Revolution in Russia, there were calls by Western leaders to isolate the Bolshevik government, which seemed intent on promoting worldwide revolution. In March 1919, French Premier Georges Clemenceau called for a cordon sanitaire, or ring of non-communist states, to isolate the Soviet Union. Translating this phrase, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson called for a quarantine. Both phrases compare communism to a contagious disease. The U.S. refused to recognize the Soviet Union, but President Franklin D. Roosevelt reversed the policy in 1933, hoping to expand American export markets. The Munich Agreement of 1938 was an attempt to contain Nazi expansion in Europe. It failed. The U.S. tried to contain Japanese expansion in Asia in 1937-41, and Japan reacted with its attack on Pearl Harbor. After Germany invaded the USSR in 1941 during the World War II, the US and the Soviet Union found themselves allied in opposition to Germany. The policy was rollback to destroy Germany and Japan. Origin: key State Department personnel grew increasingly frustrated with and suspicious of the Soviets as the war drew to a close. Averell Harriman, U.S. ambassador in Moscow, once a confirmed optimist regarding U.S.-Soviet relations, was disillusioned by what he saw as the Soviet betrayal of the 1944 Warsaw Uprising as well as by violations of the February 1945 Yalta Agreement concerning Poland. Harriman would later have a significant influence in forming Truman's views on the Soviet Union. In February 1946, the U.S. State Department asked George F. Kennan, then at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, why the Russians opposed the creation of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. He responded with a wide-ranging analysis of Russian policy now called the Long Telegram. According to Kennan, the Soviets perceived themselves to be in a state of perpetual war with capitalism. The Soviets would use controllable Marxists in the capitalist world as allies. Soviet aggression was not aligned with the views of the Russian people or with economic reality, but with historic Russian xenophobia and paranoia. The Soviet government structure prevented objective or accurate pictures of internal and external reality. Kennan's cable was hailed in the State Department as the appreciation of the situation that had long been needed. Kennan himself attributed the enthusiastic reception to timing. 6 months earlier the message would probably have been received in the State Department with raised eyebrows and lips pursed in disapproval. 6 months later, it would probably have sounded redundant. Clark Clifford and George Elsey produced a report elaborating on the long telegram and proposing concrete policy recommendations based on its analysis. This report, which recommended restraining and confining Soviet influence, was presented to Truman on September 24, 1946. In January 1947, Kennan drafted an essay entitled The Sources of Soviet Conduct. Navy Secretary James Forrestal gave permission for the report to be published in the journal Foreign Affairs under the pseudonym X. Biographer Douglas Brinkley has dubbed Forrestal Godfather of Containment on account of his work in distributing Kennan's writing. The use of the word containment originates from this so-called X article. In these circumstances it is clear that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Kennan later turned against the containment policy and noted several deficiencies in his X article. He later said that by containment he meant not the containment of Soviet power by military means of a military threat, but the political containment of a political threat. Second, Kennan admitted a failure in the article to specify the geographical scope of containment, and that containment was not something he believed the United States could necessarily achieve everywhere successfully. Harry Truman, after Republicans gained control of Congress in the 1946 elections, President Truman, a Democrat, made a dramatic speech that is often used to mark the beginning of the Cold War. In March 1947, he requested that Congress appropriate $400 million in aid to the Greek and Turkish governments, then fighting communist subversion. Truman pledged to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This pledge became known as the Truman Doctrine. Portraying the issue as a mighty clash between totalitarian regimes and free peoples, the speech marks the adoption of containment as official U.S. policy. Congress appropriated the money. Truman's motives on this occasion have been the subject of considerable scholarship and several schools of interpretation. In the orthodox explanation of Herbert V., a series of aggressive Soviet actions in 1945–47 in Poland, Iran, Turkey and elsewhere awakened the American public to this new danger to freedom, and Truman responded. In the revisionist view of William Apperman Williams, Truman's speech was an expression of long-standing American expansionism. In the realpolitik view of Lynn Davis, Truman was a naive idealist who unnecessarily provoked the Soviets by couching disputes in terms like democracy and freedom that were alien to the communist vision. According to psychological analysis by Deborah Larson, Truman felt a need to prove his decisiveness and feared that aides would make unfavorable comparisons between him and his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt. "I am here to make decisions, and whether they prove right or wrong I am going to take them," he once said. The drama surrounding the announcement of the Truman Doctrine catered to President's self-image of a strong and decisive leader, but his real decision-making process was more complex and gradual. The timing of the speech was not a response to any Soviet action, but rather to the fact that the Republican Party had just gained control of Congress. Truman was little involved in drafting the speech and did not himself adopt the hardline attitude it suggested until several months later. The British, with their own position weakened by economic distress, urgently called on the U.S. to take over the traditional British role in Greece. Under-Secretary of State Dean Acheson took the lead in Washington, warning congressional leaders in late February 1947 that if the United States did not take over from the British, the result most probably would be a Soviet breakthrough that might open 3 continents to Soviet penetration. Truman was explicit about the challenge of communism taking control of Greece. He won wide support from both parties as well as experts in foreign policy inside and outside the government. It was strongly opposed by the left, as represented by former Vice President Henry A. Wallace, who ran against Truman in the 1948 presidential campaign. Truman, under the guidance of Dean Acheson, followed up his speech with a series of measures to contain Soviet influence in Europe, including the Marshall Plan, or European Recovery Program, and NATO, a military alliance between the US and Western European nations created in 1949. Because containment required detailed information about communist moves, the government relied increasingly on the Central Intelligence Agency. Established by the National Security Act of 1947, the CIA conducted espionage in foreign lands, some of it visible, more of it secret. Truman approved a classified statement of containment policy called NSC 20 Quarters in November 1948, the first comprehensive statement of security policy ever created by the United States. The Soviet Union's first nuclear test in 1949 prompted the National Security Council to formulate a revised security doctrine. Completed in April 1950, it became known as NSC 68. It concluded that a massive military buildup was necessary to deal with the Soviet threat. According to the report, drafted by Paul Nitz and others, Alternative Strategies, there were three alternative policies to containment under discussion in the late 1940s. The first was a return to isolationism, minimizing American involvement with the rest of the world. This policy was favored by conservative Republicans, especially from the Midwest, including former President Herbert Hoover and Senator Robert A. Taft. However, many Republicans, led by Oregon Senator Arthur H. Vandenberg, said that policy has led to World War II, and was too dangerous to revive. A second policy was continuation of the dark copyright tent policies of friendly relationships, especially trade, with the Soviet Union. Roosevelt himself had been the champion of dark copyright tent, but he was dead, and most of his inner circle had left the government by 1946. The chief proponent of dark copyright tent was Henry A. Wallace, former vice president and currently the Secretary of Commerce under Truman. Wallace's position was supported by far-left elements of the CIO, but they were themselves purged in 1947-48. Wallace ran against Truman on the Progressive Party ticket in 1948, but his campaign was increasingly dominated by communists and our copyright tent was discredited. The third policy was rollback, an aggressive effort to undercut or destroy the Soviet Union itself. Military rollback against the Soviet Union was proposed by James Burnham and other conservative strategists in the late 1940s. After 1954, Burnham and like-minded strategists became editors and regular contributors to William F. Buckley's magazine, The National Review. Truman himself adopted a rollback strategy in the Korean War after the success of the Incan landings in September 1950, only to reverse himself after the Chinese counterattack 2 months later. Under President Eisenhower, there was much discussion whether the U.S. should pursue a rollback strategy against communism in Eastern Europe in 1953-56. The decision was not to. The main argument against rollback was that the Soviets might well respond with World War I, and in 1950 they were known to have nuclear weapons. Korea, the U.S. entered the Korean War to defend South Korea from a communist invasion, that is, following containment doctrine. However, the success of the Incan landing inspired the U.S. and the United Nations to adopt a rollback strategy to overthrow the communist North Korean regime, thus allowing nationwide elections under UN auspices. General Douglas MacArthur then advanced across the 38th parallel into North Korea. The Chinese then sent in a large army and defeated the UN forces, pushing them below the 38th parallel. Although the Chinese had been planning to intervene for months, this action was interpreted by Truman's supporters as a response to U.S. forces crossing the 38th parallel. This interpretation allowed the episode to be used to confirm the wisdom of containment doctrine as opposed to rollback. The Communists were later pushed back, to around the original border. Truman blamed MacArthur's focus on victory and adopted a limited war policy. His focus shifted to negotiating a settlement, which was finally reached in 1953. For his part, MacArthur denounced Truman's no-win policy. Dulles, many Republicans, including John Foster Dulles, concluded that Truman had been too timid. In 1952, Dulles called for rollback and the eventual liberation of Eastern Europe. Dulles was named Secretary of State by incoming President Dwight Eisenhower, but Eisenhower's decision not to intervene during the Hungarian Uprising of 1956 made containment a bipartisan doctrine. President Eisenhower relied on clandestine CIA actions to undermine hostile governments and used economic and military foreign aid to strengthen governments supporting the American position in the Cold War. Vietnam, Senator Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate for president in 1964, challenged containment and asked, "Why not victory?" President Johnson, the Democratic nominee, answered that rollback risked nuclear war. Johnson explained containment doctrine by quoting the Bible, "Hitherto shalt thou come, but not further." Goldwater lost to Johnson in the general election by a wide margin. Johnson adhered closely to containment during the Vietnam War. Rejecting proposals by General William Westmoreland that U.S. ground forces advance into Laos and cut communist supply lines, Johnson gathered a group of elder statesmen called the Wise Men. This group included Kennan, Attribution and other former Truman advisers. Rallies in support of the troops were discouraged for fear that a patriotic response would lead to demands for victory and rollback. Military responsibility was divided among three generals so that no powerful theater commander could emerge to challenge Johnson as MacArthur had challenged Truman. Nixon, who replaced Johnson in 1969, referred to his foreign policy as dark copyright tent, or a relaxation of tension. Although it continued to aim at restraining the Soviet Union, it was based on political realism, or thinking in terms of national interest, as opposed to crusades against communism or for democracy. Emphasis was placed on talks with the Soviet Union concerning nuclear weapons called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Nixon reduced U.S. military presence in Vietnam to the minimum required to contain communist advances, a policy called Vietnamization. As the war continued, it grew less popular. A Democratic Congress forced Nixon, a Republican, to abandon this policy in 1973 by enacting the Cassia-Euro-Church Amendment. This law ended U.S. military involvement in Vietnam and led to violent communist takeovers of South Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. President Jimmy Carter came to office committed to a foreign policy that emphasized human rights. But in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, containment was again made a priority. The wording of the Carter Doctrine intentionally echoes that of the Truman Doctrine. Ronald Reagan, following the communist victory in Vietnam, Democrats began to view further communist advances inevitable while Republicans returned to rollback doctrine. Ronald Reagan, a longtime advocate of rollback, was elected U.S. President in 1980. Reagan took a more aggressive approach to dealings with the USSR, believing that dark copyright tent was misguided and peaceful coexistence was tantamount to surrender. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, American policymakers worried that the Soviets were making a run for control of the Persian Gulf. Throughout the 1980s, under a policy that came to be known as the Reagan Doctrine, the United States provided technical and economic assistance to the Afghan guerrillas fighting against the Soviet Army. By sending military aid to anti-communist insurgents in Afghanistan, Angola, Cambodia, and Nicaragua, he confronted existing communist governments and went beyond the limits of containment doctrine. He deployed the Pershing II missile in Europe and promoted research on a strategic defense initiative, which critics called Star Wars, to shoot down missiles fired at the United States. Reagan's aim was to defeat the Soviets through an expensive arms buildup the Soviets could not match. However, Reagan continued to follow containment doctrine in several key areas. He pursued a comprehensive nuclear disarmament initiative called Start Iron policy toward Europe, continued to emphasize a NATO-based defensive approach. The end of the Cold War in 1991 marked the official end of U.S. containment policy, though it kept its bases in the areas around Russia, such as ones in Iceland, Germany, and Turkey. Also much of the containment policy helped influenced U.S. foreign policy in later years such as during the War on Terror and dealing with post-Cold War dictators. See also, Copyright Tent, Marshall Plan, Rollback, Truman Doctrine, Non-Cold War, China Containment Policy, Notes and References. Further reading, Cork, Sarah Jane. History, Historians and the Naming of Foreign Policy, A Postmodern Reflection on American Strategic Thinking During the Truman Administration, Intelligence and National Security, Autumn 2001, Volume 16 Issue 3, ppA 146-63, Gaddis, John Lewis, Strategies of Containment, A Critical Appraisal of American National Security Policy During the Cold War 2004. ISBN 978-0-19-517447-2, Hopkins, Michael F. Continuing Debate and New Approaches in Cold War History, Historical Journal, 50, 913-934 doi, 10.1017 per second 0018246X070064337, Kennan, George F., American Diplomacy, The University of Chicago Press. 1984. ISBN 0-226-43147-9, Pieper, Maritza Containment and the Cold War, Re-examining the Doctrine of Containment as a Grand Strategy Driving U.S. Cold War Interventions. StudentPulse.com. Retrieved August 22, 2012. Wright, Stephen. The United States and Persian Gulf Security, The Foundations of the War on Terror, Ithaca Press, 2007. ISBN 978-0-86372-321-6.